Hey, what's up guys, it's BenBonk and welcome back to the 26th Slimekeep Devlog. In this devlog, I finalized the Slime King boss fight and started working on tying the game loop together. Also, if you're new here, Slimekeep is a fast-paced roguelike where you must kill and capture slimes to stop the corruption that has infected your land. Without further ado, let's get into it. So in the last devlog, I started working on revamping the journey to the Slime Keep. I pretty much just had the stock, but the water just didn't look that nice, so I wanted to fix this. I started off by changing the color to be a brighter green and added a bunch of different bubbles to the scene. Originally, I was going to make this a river area, but I think this solution looks just as good and took me way less time to make, which is always nice. Next, I needed to work on the actual keep area, which is where you fight the Slime King, if you don't know, and the keep itself. So I hopped into Unity and started working on this area. I wanted to make sure that there was a little boat ride animation of the player arriving, so I started drafting that out. Then after a bit of programming, I made this simple cutscene for the player. After reaching the edge of the screen here, the player will swap scenes and start this cutscene to mark their progression. It's a simple touch, but I really like how the camera kind of moves along and these sort of waves I made from the player reaches the shore. I then used these same waves to polish up the dock and make the water or slime substance, or whatever you want to call it, feel more alive. I also realized I needed a button prop for the player to enter the boat, so I just added a simple one in. Now, the cutscene was pretty much done, so it's time to work on the area leading up to the fight. First, I shrunk this landing zone to be more compact and started working on the next room, which would be where the keep would reside. I just made this big massive fall using Unity's particle system, which created a sort of build up to the keep itself. Also, maybe this stuff represents the corruption, which is the main conflict of the game. I'll let your imagination do the work. But back to the keep, it was now time to design this thing. And Doormat offered to do this, so I sent him over the tile set, and while I was waiting, I decided to make this animation for whenever the player walks past the torch, which would just turn that torch on. It's a subtle detail, but I think things like this really help to set the mood for what's to come. But after that, Doormat had finished up the keep concept, so I implemented this in game, which I think looked like a great start, so huge thanks to him. But there's still a lot to be done to get this keep looking good. So I made a bunch of additions to the keep, which made it feel so much more alive. I also made a quick cutscene about how the guards have been expecting you, and made it so the player could actually enter the keep. Next, I needed to work on the most important feature of the keep, which was of course this epic flag that I made to go on top. So now in game, the outside was basically done, I then started working on the inside of the keep. As you can see, once the player enters the keep, everything turns black, these spears block off the exit, and the player is trapped in this little room. I know this area isn't great right now, and I might come back to it, but I just kind of liked how it's mysterious, and I didn't really have the time to spend a bunch more time creating an in-depth and detailed build-up room. But what I did do is make the transition into the fight corridor room. Pretty much the camera would just zoom in, which kind of gave the player a cramped feeling, which is what I was going for. So yeah, that's pretty much the keep right there. I know it's not anything crazy, but it should get the job done for now. And speaking of now, right now you can wishlist Slimekeep on Steam. It costs absolutely nothing except for a few clicks and massively helps with the Steam algorithm, so I'd really appreciate it if you just had a second to do so. Anyways, one final thing that I worked on for the area was I wanted there to be a shop for the players so they can use all their currency right before they fight the king. So when thinking about what kind of shopkeeper to make, I remember that Toasted Toast in my Discord made this really cool shopkeeper concept that has just been dying to be used. So with Toast's permission, I figured I'd use this awesome animation for the shopkeeper. So I just set this guy up in Unity and gave him 2 upgrades for the player to choose from. You'll also notice that I remade the surrounding area to fit the shop, which I think is an overall improvement. Then I got the actual upgrade bind set up so the player could actually purchase these upgrades. All this was cool, but I wanted the shopkeeper to be a bit different from other regular shopkeepers. So I had the idea of making it so the shopkeeper would display 2 upgrades, and then once the player buys one of those upgrades, the other upgrade would disappear, and the shopkeeper would display another 2 upgrades. And this would repeat another 2 times, so the player could buy a total of 3 upgrades. And after working on this system for a bit, things were working and looked good. The player could buy upgrades, the upgrades would refresh, and all that jazz. But there was still one major problem. I noticed that the shopkeeper would offer the player upgrades that they already bought on previous cycles. After looking into the code, I realized that I only made sure not to repeat upgrades each separate cycle, instead of making sure the shopkeeper couldn't offer a repeat upgrade based on the player's inventory of upgrades. So to fix this, I added in this check to the upgrade generator function, which made sure that the shopkeeper couldn't offer a repeat upgrade. This did the job, so I'm glad I picked up on this now. Next, I just added bubbles into all the sides of the slime goo, as I previously forgot to do that, and I also added in a system to get the shopkeeper to sell these upgrades at half price compared to the regular shopkeepers, which should help the player a bit. Finally, I made this little snippet of dialogue for the shopkeeper to encourage the player in beating the king, and I also made this cycle counter, which shows how many more cycles of potential upgrades the shopkeeper has to offer, which just gave a little more visual clarity to the player. And that was a new shopkeeper for you. Let me know what you think, I'm really happy with it. So that was pretty much the new keep area, but before I move on, I should address that many of you guys have suggested that there should be enemies or puzzles or mazes or some kind of trial before the player can fight the king. However, I won't be doing such a thing, as I think the king is a good enough trial himself, and it would just be a bunch more extra work for me, which I don't think is really too essential to the game right now. But moving on, I just had a few more things I want to adjust for the Slime King boss fight. First, I got some feedback that the rubble cracks cracked too slowly and disappeared too quickly, so I made some small adjustments to the cracks, and I think they looked a bit better. I also slightly edited the Slime King dialogue to not include the king's instructions for the player to use the capture gun. I intended to include this to see if the player would betray the king or not, but I can see how one might think it limits the player's sense of discovery, so I'll leave it out for now. It'll just depend on what I end up doing for the Indians, so I'll see. But with all that final boss fight stuff done, it was time to move on to something else. I decided that it was time to get back to working on the game loop. This is something that's been in the works for quite a long time, and I really just want to tie everything together as soon as possible, which is one of the reasons why I recently made the Slime King boss fight. But it can be a bit difficult to do this, as creating a game loop requires a lot of content to have things feel right and to have the difficulty scale over time. And by content, I mean weapons, enemies, boss fights, upgrades, room layouts, and so on. I feel like I have barely enough content in all those categories to sort of get by, except for room layouts and level designs or flows. So I decided to kind of focus my efforts on day layout and progression ideas. So I drafted some of my ideas onto a Google Doc. Some of these ideas ended up being that there would be a shop every other day, a boss every 4 days, and room difficulty scaling up with each new day. So with that doc made, I decided to get into creating a bunch more rooms for the game, as that's what I figured the game really needed at this point, at least before I work on the day progression and flow. I started off by redrawing each of the 5 current rooms that are in the game right now, to be quite a bit bigger. I think they're just way too small previously, and I wanted to make sure that the player wouldn't be too cramped in combat. That was a good start, but I wasn't even close to being done. My goal is to create around 50 rooms with 10 rooms for each level of room difficulty, as there are 5 tiers of difficulty that each room in the game can be, if you didn't know. So I started off by creating a rule tile to make the process of creating these rooms much easier, as it was a pain to manually create rooms. However, once I made a few rooms with this rule tile and tried to test them out, I quickly ran into a major issue. This was because in order for rule tiles to work, they need to have the insides filled with that same rule tile. And once the room generates, it creates corridor entrances, which just make it impossible for the player to enter the room. And I couldn't just make a rule tile for the outsides of the walls because then the rules would just break. I tried for a while to find a solution, but I just couldn't figure one out. So I emailed Andre, the creator of the procedural generation asset that I used, to see if he had any ideas for a solution. We exchanged emails for a few days and he tried giving me a few scripts to test, but unfortunately they just didn't work with my case. So I kind of just gave up then and there. Huge thanks to Andre for trying to help me, and I'm sure there is some kind of solution, but I decided to stick with handmade rooms for now. So I started creating a bunch of rooms, which took me days of really boring and tedious work, but let's roll the montage that makes this look really cool because of the music. And with all those rooms done, here's what some of them look like in game. I really like these new room layouts, and it's nice to have at least a bit of variety. I then split these rooms into 10 rooms for each difficulty. I didn't have the enemies set up yet, which gives them their difficulty, but the concept was still there. So with all these room templates made, I wanted to start adding some enemies to give them the needed difficulty, but I also wanted to first fix a few more issues in level graphs before I did this. So let's look at level graphs. If you don't know, these are the templates for how levels or days are generated in Slimekeep. Originally, I was going to do around 7 to 8 enemy rooms for the first day and increase the number of rooms the players have to fight through after every boss fight, so every 4 days. But this just didn't feel right in game. There was just way too many rooms to start out with. So I changed it to have the first day start out with 3 enemy rooms. Then every 2 days, a new enemy room would be added on, adding a gradual sense of progression. Next, as I was testing day playthroughs, I realized that it could be hard to tell where to go and annoying to backtrack. So before I started working on adding enemies, I really wanted to address this, as this room flow is a very important part of the gameplay loop. So I started off by wanting to make a big minimap that the player could view at any time. I already had plans to make this inside the slime book at some point, so now felt like a good time to do so. But even before I did that, I wanted to rework the slime book's art as it just looked really ugly. So I posted about this in my Discord server, and Witch Doctor in my Discord server made this really cool back cover, so with permission I added this into the game. I really like how this looks, and it's definitely a massive upgrade from before, so thanks Witch Doctor. But moving on, I was really annoyed by how the book appeared and disappeared extremely slowly, and just felt very sluggish in general. So I made some small tweaks and got the book to appear and disappear much faster than before. I also sped up the speed of flipping pages, which seemed to help a bit. Back to the actual task, I set up the minimap in the book. This wasn't too difficult, as all I really needed to do was copy the render texture from the small minimap and increase the size of it. Now, this is cool and all, but I really wanted to make sure that this minimap was dynamic and user-friendly, so I gave the player the ability to use their scroll wheel to adjust the zoom of the minimap. Another thing I wanted to add were these icons to tell the player where undiscovered rooms were. I started off by trying to make these question marks that would appear in these undiscovered corridors. However, I couldn't find a way to make these icons appear above the fog. So I tried switching to arrows, but I also wasn't a huge fan. So instead, I just made these lights appear in the corridors, which I think did the job. I also had to make a system to have these lights disappear after entering a room, so that was pretty neat, and there's the new slime book for you. I think I was going to get to working on some other things, but I quickly ran into some super fun bugs. For some reason, after adding these new rooms in the game, the player could sometimes clear a room, leave that room, and upon re-entering, the doors of said room would close when they shouldn't have. This bug was a major pain to figure out, as there are so many things that could have caused it. So basically, I spent 2 whole days trying to figure out the issue, and I eventually found out that this check for when to spawn enemies was wrong, as I had some incorrect parentheses, which messed up the check if the room type isn't a difficulty 1 room. But I fixed this, and yeah, pretty much life of a game dev right there. But back to work, I figured that if I was going to work on days or level progression, I should probably make a button prompt for the bed, so I just did that. You'll also notice that I made the player spawn inside of the house now, to make things actually feel right. And finally, I fixed the entrance/exit of the house and some colliders to look and feel a bit more smooth. Next up, I made a small fix to the boat room on the minimap as it previously looked a little weird, so now I think it looks a bit more natural. The final big thing I wanted to work on was a teleportation or fast travel system for the game. As I was testing, it was kind of a pain to backtrack a lot just to get where you're trying to go, so I really wanted to address this. I knew I wanted to do something with teleportation, so I asked my Discord server, and Circle came up with this idea for puddles that the player could teleport between. This sounded neat, so I got to work. I started off by making this puddle, and puddle animation once the player presses E on the puddle. Moving on, I added a puddle minimap icon to give the player some clarity and scripted the puddle to make it look like the player went under the puddle upon entering it. Then, once the player is under the puddle, the slime book would open. The plan was for the player to be able to select which room they want to teleport from here. And since this was the case, I decided to give the player the ability to click and drag on the minimap to move the minimap around. Then, I started working on the actual teleport logic. I really wanted the player to have the ability to click on a room on the minimap and teleport there if a puddle is in that room. But I just spent days trying to figure out how to get input from a render texture, and ultimately, I just gave up. I'm sure there's a way, but I just conceded using buttons to teleport instead. So now the player could press this test button and they would teleport to the current puddle. I then just grinded out the system a bit more and added a lot more functionality. For example, now this button would have a number, and it would work as before. The player could also now press tab to close the book instead of clicking on the desired button. I then made puddle spawning, so for every 3 rooms a puddle would spawn. It's just 1 for here, but that's just for testing purposes. So now, the player could teleport between all the puddles discovered and the appropriate buttons would show. I know this might not look like much, but there are a lot of moving parts here, and potential for bugs, so it took ages to iron everything out and get all the systems and interactions functioning together. So this is great progress, but there's still a bit left to do. First, I kept the puddle icons on the regular minimap, but changed them to numbers to display what number the puddle was, so the player could actually tell what button to press. And I also made a quick sprite to replace the temporary button art. Finally, I added some of the bubbles from the boat area to the puddle to give it some more life. And there we go, teleportation system done. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out, and hopefully it should help the gameplay a lot, but make sure to let me know what you think in the comments below. So with that said, that's it for now. Sorry this devlog was kinda all over the place, and I couldn't really get any creating finished room concepts, but I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, consider liking, subscribing, and wishlisting Slimekeep. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.